having the opportunity to talk today about climate change and its impact on past societies. So you might think that, the interest in the impact of climate change on past societies is something new, but it's actually, there have been studies back already in the 19th century, the early 20th century. There were studies about climate change and its impact on human societies in the past. But there's a lot more interest in the past decades. So in the past decades, numerous publications have appeared about the impact of climate change on societies, whether that's the Roman Empire, whether that is Maya civilization, whether that is Imperial China, Angkor, or many other societies. Usually, the perspective of those publications is that they see climate change as the main driver of change in those societies. So usually the rise and decline of these empires and civilizations is linked to climate change. If you take the Roman Empire as an example, the idea then is that the Roman Empire rose because of the Roman warm period, the centuries warm period, and at the end of the Roman warm period then caused its decline. So generally in this kind of study, climate change is seen as a very determining factor in the rise and decline of these civilizations. Now, that there's so much interest in past decades about the impact of climate change on past societies undoubtedly has to do with global warming. The idea and the realization that climate is changing now has triggered a lot more attention to climate change and its impact in the past. Now, there are two perspectives, as it were, on this issue. One perspective is, well, climate has been changing always. There's always been climate change. So we should not actually worry about that, and we should not link that to human impact on the environment. It's even also claimed, well, you had the medieval warm period, and that brought prosperity in Europe, so we should not worry about warm periods. Obviously, that's nonsense. Obviously, that's the wrong argument. If only because global warming is quite unprecedented, at least if you look at the past few thousands of years. The extent of climate change, the speed of climate change, the fact that climate change is almost the same globally, that's unprecedented. Nothing like that has been seen in the past few thousand years. So the idea that climate has always changed, that we therefore should not worry about global warming, that should be rejected. And luckily, you don't hear that often anymore. But in current debates about global warming, there's also another impact. Then people look at the past and say, we should take climate change seriously, because look at the past. Entire empires fell, entire civilizations declined. So that is proof that we should take climate change and global warming seriously. And that we should take global warming seriously, that's obvious, and that's not something that I would want to deny. So let me stress that at the outset. But on the other hand, I think it's also quite risky if you start interpreting the past in terms of its role in current debates, if you start interpreting the past through the lens of contemporary issues. So while I would not want to deny the role of the importance and the seriousness of global warming, I think at the same time, we should have a nuanced perspective on the impact of climate change in the past. And I think that historians do have a role to play in those debates, and that we should avoid easy answers. So that's one of the things that I intend to do, and to bring the story, as it were, of the impact of climate change on past societies, integrating both climatological, paleoclimatological aspects and society. Now, one other issue that I have to address is what do I actually mean when I talk about climate change? Because in the literature, in the studies about the impact of climate change in the past, you often see that extreme weather events is used as an argument. So people pointing out the impact of hurricanes, of floodings, of dry seasons, and undoubtedly, clearly, this kind of weather events can have potentially a catastrophic impact on societies. But when we talk about climate change, we actually talk about a different temporal scale. We are not talking about events, we're talking about processes that take place over a longer time. The definition of climate is based on its larger temporal scale. So when we're talking about climate, we're talking about a period of at least 30 years. So when I'm talking about climate change, I'm not talking about extreme events, but I'm talking about changes. My definition of climate change then is changing weather patterns that includes the frequency and severity of extreme events at a multi-decadal scale, so at a scale of at least 30 years or more. And why is that important to make that distinction? That's important because, well, societies can adapt. If patterns change, the weather patterns, climate as it were, is always a determining factor in how societies function. So if that climate changes, if those patterns change, then societies can and often will adapt. Agricultural systems can adapt. Society at large can adapt. So my main point is that societies are not passive subjects to climate change, and that the societal response to changes in these patterns can change their vulnerability, can change their resilience to climate change. But there's one other aspect, and that is that not only the response to climate change changes the resilience and vulnerability of societies, but also changes within society itself. Now, one other aspect that I want to point out is that, like I said, the idea that climate change and the attention to climate change and its impact on human society is not really new. But the earliest studies of climate change, they had much less data than people had, than scholars have nowadays. So the earliest people studying climate change, their data were much scarcer, and did not offer the detail that we have nowadays. So the first studies interpreted and seemed to see in the data evidence for long and uniform climate eras. So they identify climate change in terms of these centuries-long climatic eras. So going to the recent past, before the modern period, the Little Ice Age, which was dated variably, but basically between 1400 and 1850, they identified the Little Ice Age. And before that, you had the medieval warm period. And before the medieval warm period, you had the late antique Little Ice Age, and then before that, you had the Roman warm period. So a sequence of colder and warmer periods going back into the past, but seen as quite uniform centuries-long periods. That kind of thinking has changed through the progress of paleoclimatology. And I understand that there are several paleoclimatologists among the audience, so I'm not telling anything new to them, but maybe then for the historians among the audience. What has changed in paleoclimatology over the past decades is that technological progress now allows to do things that were 20 years impossible. So we have much better, much more detailed data than one had 20 years ago. The methodology has improved, so the interpretation of the data has improved a lot. much better understanding of the biases of what is possible and how to interpret the data. And then there's many more studies than there were 20 years ago. So that brings also a lot more detail in this image. And so the image has changed. The realization now is that there's much more variance in space and over time. So there's much more differentiation needed in that model of climate change over the past. And we're talking about, let's say, the past 2,000 years. Now, also, probably not really necessary for the paleoclimatologists among us, but maybe for the historians, that's a very brief overview of what are actually our sources for understanding, for reconstructing the climate change over the past 2,000 years. Now, for the recent period, the most recent period, we have obviously the instrumental data. So that offers all the detail that we want to know about precipitation, about temperature, whatever. But if you go back, and it depends on where you are in the world, but if you go back beyond the 19th century, you don't have instrumental data. Now, for the fairly recent past, very important is human observations that are written down in all kinds of forms, whether that's ships' journals where the captains note down the weather, whether that is people keeping diaries, whether that is notes about bridges that are destroyed. So there's a lot of human observations in the fairly recent past of climatic conditions, or better put, weather conditions. At the same time, very important for the fairly recent part, the pre-modern period, is tree-ring evidence. The big advantage of tree-ring evidence is that you can date it very well, because you have these annual rings. So the annual rings reflect the growth of these trees during their growth period. In the moderate, temperate, and colder areas, that's usually the growth during growing season is usually determined mostly by temperature. So that is a good indicator of temperature conditions. In other parts, it can be more water availability, and then it's a signal of precipitation, even water availability. Now, because this is in most regions, the growing season of trees is, let's say, spring, early summer, it's a reflection of the temperature in spring, early summer, May, June, July, something like that. So it's an indicator of summer temperature. It doesn't really, in many places, we won't say anything about winter temperature. If you go back beyond the fairly recent past, and again, it depends on where you are, but if you, let's say, we go back to the Middle Ages, you lose the human observations in many parts of the world. Not in the sense that people will not notice anything anymore about weather conditions, but those data become too sparse, too isolated, too fragmented, and then you cannot really analyze. But then, if you go back to, let's say, 1,000 years ago, you still have the tree rings. If you go back even further in time, it's not that you lose the tree rings entirely, but then the tree ring evidence becomes a lot sparser. And if you go back 2,000 years ago, most of the tree ring evidence pertains to high altitudes, so high up in the mountains, or pertains to high latitudes, high north, for example, Scandinavia, so alpine mountains, mountains. But the disadvantage there is that this is not then a local thing. You can analyze summer temperatures in the alpine mountains, but that doesn't really say something about temperature trends 2,000 kilometers further away. So for the early societies, we are largely depending on things like lake sediments or stalagmites and speleothems. And they do reflect various ways, temperature trends, precipitation trends, and all other kinds of evidence. But the big disadvantage of those signals is that they cannot be dated so very precisely. So human observations, tree rings, they say something about an exact year. You can say the weather conditions in 1571 were like this. But if you go back to the earlier parts of the first millennium, first centuries of the common era, you can seldomly say something with that kind of resolution. So then you can say something like, the beginning of the 6th century was colder, warmer, wetter, drier than the middle of the century. But you cannot really say weather conditions in 517 were like this or that. So then you lose a lot of detail. This contains a lot of information. What we see here, the red line, is summer temperature in the northern hemisphere based on tree rings. So it's a reconstruction from the first 2,000 years of the common era based on tree ring evidence, except for the blue line here in this part, because the blue line, that's actually based on instrumental data, and there you see global warming if you doubt about the visible. So what we see here is northern hemisphere summer temperatures, average for the northern hemisphere. You also see a black horizontal line. The black horizontal line reflects the average for the 1961-1990 period, based on instrumental data. So what we see in the red lines is then how did this earlier period compare to the 1961-1990 average? So you can see usually it's below. So this is half a degree, 1 degree below the 1960 average. Sometimes it's above the 1961-1990 average. Now, a few things are clearly visible if you look at the graph. If you compare the last 1,000 years with the 1,000 years preceding it, it's clearly visible that the last 1,000 years are a bit colder than, at least in the northern hemisphere, the south. So actually, there was a trend in the later Holocene, long-term trend of declining temperature, gradually declining temperature. You can also see these colored columns, green and blue. Now, the blue columns reflect cold periods, the green columns, they reflect warm periods. So these are 3 cold spells. This is actually how the little ice age is seen nowadays. So not one cold period of more than 400 years, it's seen as 3 cold spells, little ice age 1, little ice age 2, little ice age 3. If you look at the warm periods, so instead of seeing the medieval warm period as several centuries of warm conditions, it's now seen as a relatively brief warm period. The same with the Roman warm period, actually quite late, more like the 3rd century. That is nowadays how one understands the Roman warm period. There's a lot more. What we see here at the bottom is volcanic eruptions. Volcanic eruptions clearly visible in, for instance, Greenland ice. So volcanic eruptions that bring a lot of volcanic material into the atmosphere that comes down again. And we can clearly see that in the Greenland ice cores, and we can date that precisely. So you can actually analyze volcanic activity over the past thousands of years. So here it's indicated as volcanic eruptions. And then it's clear that volcanic eruptions are a determining factor in northern hemisphere average summer temperatures. So when there's a lot, when the volcanic activity goes up, summer temperatures in the northern hemisphere go down. If you have a period of relatively low volcanic activity, temperatures go up. So there's an inverse relationship between volcanic activity and summer temperature in the northern hemisphere. Volcanic activity is actually the main driver of temperature shifts at a decadal or multi-decadal timescale. One other thing that I want to point out here, very important, is there are human events indicated here. So they show various human events. The fall of the Roman Empire, traditionally dated in 476. So the traditional date here, the fall of the Roman Empire, happens to be at a relatively cold period. There are other events here. The Manchu conquest of China at the end of the Ming Dynasty. That's also indicated, and it's also in an extreme period. So the suggestion is made here that they offer a link between human events and summer temperature. So the suggestion is made that it does not simply reflect synchronicity, but also causality. So the fall of the Roman Empire did not just happen at a cold time, but it happened because of cold time. So there's an argument about causality that is based on the synchronicity. Things happen to occur at the same time, human events and climatic events, and thus there must be a causal relationship. They happen because of it. Now, that's very problematic. There are several things that are problematic. One thing, most historical processes that go on do not really occur in terms of events, they occur in longer term processes. And then synchronicity, to what extent needs there to be synchronicity? What is actually the methodology behind synchronicity? So when can we speak about things happening at the same time, and then we can establish that there is a causal relationship behind that? Now, let's think in terms of a volcanic eruption. If there's a volcanic eruption that brings about harvest failure, and then after 2 years of harvest failure, there's a rebellion, and then you can say, okay, that there's a clear, you can talk about that in terms of causality, the causal link. But does a consequence always have to be right after that? So what is the established time scale of causality? You can think in terms of, well, society has a certain level of resilience of coping strategies. So you first have to have a buildup of tension. So a climatic trend does not immediately have to result in a visible consequence in society. It can be that it first takes some tension to build up and then something happens. But what is then the established time scale? What is the theory? What is the methodology behind that? So it is very difficult to establish on the basis of synchronicity or a causal link. But it also means that it's very difficult to disprove that kind of argument. But it is more problematic than that, because if you have taken just the example of the volcanic eruption leading to harvest failure and then to rebellion, nobody would argue that it's simply and only the volcanic eruption that then causes the rebellion, because there has to be a certain vulnerability in the society for a volcanic eruption leading to harvest failure and then leading to a rebellion. So a societal aspect has to be there as well. So you can never see that purely in terms of climate factors. But then the question is, what is then the balance between what role do these societal factors play next to climatic factors? It would be nice if we could do history, if we could do historical experiments. It would be nice if we could say, let's do this period again, but without the volcanic eruption. Would the same thing happen then? But obviously we cannot do that because history is a science without experiments. So then we have to analyze. I want to give one example of what I mean. I think that is clearer. And that's the eruption of the Okmok volcano in 43 BC. So this Okmok volcano in Alaska erupted in 43 BCE. That's clearly visible in the ice cores, so we can date that quite precisely. And there was a lot of attention to this study a couple of years ago, a few years ago. Globally, a lot of attention, maybe more visible for me as a Roman historian. So what did they claim in this story? And I'm not reading the entire text, but I take the significance from the study itself, from these publications. Now, it says, the first century before the Common Era, fall of the Roman Republic, and the Ptolemaic kingdom, the kingdom of Cleopatra, as it were, so the fall of the Roman Republic and subsequent rise of the Roman Empire, so the change of a republican system to a system governed by an emperor. This was among the most important political transitions in the history of the Western civilization. Volcanic fallout in well-dated Arctic ice, core records, and other stuff show that this transition occurred during an extreme cool period resulting from a massive eruption of Alaska's Okmok volcano early in 43. So this political transition occurred during the cold period, which was caused by the Okmok volcanic eruption, suggesting significant vulnerability to hydroclimatic shocks in otherwise sophisticated and powerful ancient states. So this study claims that you had this very important transition, political transition of the Roman Empire. The Republic ended and it became a system ruled by an emperor. During this cold period, actually suggesting because of this cold period. But there are some problems with that kind of argument because, well, it's not the case that political crisis actually occurred during the cold period because it started before. The first century and before the Common Era was quite a difficult period for the Roman Republic. I'm not talking about the entire first century BC, that was a time of a lot of civil wars. But I just want to point out that already 6 years before the eruption of the Okmok volcano, a civil war broke out in 49 BC, which was won several years later by Julius Caesar. But then he was murdered in 44. That is 1 year earlier than the Okmok eruption. And it was actually his nephew that became the first emperor of the Roman Empire. So the suggestion that is made that this political transition occurred during the cold period, starting with the Okmok eruption, is actually wrong. And the political crisis, the political transition started way before. It's a much longer process going on. So then the question is, what was actually the contribution of the Okmok eruption then to the political crisis of that period? So you can argue, there was already a political crisis, but it was made more serious by the eruption. We can also argue, well, it didn't contribute very much. The political crisis was already there, and the impact of the eruption is was negligible. So with the kind of data that we have, it's very difficult to establish with any certainty what the role of the corruption was in the political events of those years. But you can certainly conclude that the corruption itself did not cause the political crisis, which brought about the change of a republican system to a tailwind system. Now, it's time to go to a first case study. So in the rest of my lecture, I will talk about a few case studies. The first is Stone Age, Neolithic Switzerland, 4th millennium BCE. And then we will talk about Roman Empire, Imperial China, Angkor, and if time allows, can also say something about Finland in the 17th century. So first, Neolithic Switzerland, the lake region in Switzerland in the 4th millennium, between 4000 and 3000 before the Common Era. Now, archaeologists study in that region settlements, lakeshore settlements, so settlements on the shores of these lakes over that period of the 4th millennium. And archaeologists have established, well, in some periods, these settlements disappear. So generally there are, but in some periods within those 1,000 years, there are no settlements on these lake shores. Now, paleoclimatologists have studied the climate in the 4th millennium at that region and that place. And they find out that there are various trends over that millennium, so wetter and warm, wetter and drier periods, the warmer and colder periods, and you can actually link the disappearance of these settlements, lakeshore settlements, to climatic conditions. So it used to be interpreted as climate change to the worst, adverse climate change, limited the resources available to these settlements, so that caused a lot of stress in these settlements, and then they disappeared, they collapsed, they could not be sustained. So it's a story of collapse, climate change-induced collapse. But more recent studies point out that there's actually a lot of continuity in the culture of these settlements, these lakeshore settlements. So before and after the gap, there's a lot of cultural continuity. So the new interpretation is that rather than collapsing, these settlements moved. And these settlements, they were built of wooden buildings that had to be replaced every generation or so anyway. So it was not that difficult if the environment changed, then to change with the changes in the environment to other places, to locate the settlements elsewhere, which offer better conditions. And when the conditions returned again, beneficial to the lakeshore settlements, they would appear again. So rather than collapse, the newer studies interpret it as a coping strategy, mobility as a coping strategy to cope with changes in the environment. So it's not a story of collapse, it's actually a story of resilience. Now, things changed with complex societies. Now, let me first say, what do I mean with complex societies? It's a very general, very vague term. So what I mean by complex societies is societies that are characterized by larger numbers, larger communities. So if you compare that to what we've just seen in Stone Age, Neolithic communities, that were communities of at most 100 people or so. Now we're talking about communities with thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people. We find greater social differentiation and the emergence of social political hierarchies. We find a greater extent of division of labor. So it's not anymore that the largest part of society using the same survival strategies. So much more differentiation within these societies. So again, this is not a very uniform category, but it's used just to distinguish it from the non-complex societies like those in Switzerland. Now, the food supply is an important link between climate, the environment, and these complex societies. And complex societies more than a significant shift in this relationship between those societies and the environment, and that includes obviously climate. Climate played a fundamental role in shaping these societies, and there are two elements that I want to stress. The one element is the annual cycle in weather conditions, in conditions of temperature and precipitation, water availability. So whether that is a spring, summer, autumn, winter cycle, or whether that is a monsoon cycle, is drier and wetter. So on the one hand, you have this annual cycle. And one other aspect is this interannual variability. So even if there's an annual cycle, basically the same, there's a clear pattern, that doesn't mean that all the years are the same. So next to this cyclical pattern, you have this interannual variability. Not all years are the same. And that is a determining factor in the food supply of societies. This cycle within the year determines availability of food. And more so with complex societies than with the non-complex societies like Neolithic settlements. Because Neolithic settlements used a much more wider spectrum of natural resources that differed throughout the year. Complex societies were usually based on a smaller spectrum of food resources, meaning that the availability of these food resources changed over the year and determined by this cyclical pattern. So you harvest once a year, and then you have to use what you harvest throughout the year, or maybe in rice cultivation twice a year. But there's a cyclical pattern. So to a certain extent, you have this predictability of this cyclical pattern, important basic factor in the shape of human society. But on the other hand, this variability, this interannual variability, meant that there's always a risk involved. So you can, for example, assume that the best time to sow is in autumn because of relatively mild conditions and the availability of water in a particular place. But there's no guarantee that all autumns will be the same. So once in a while, the autumn might be too cold, or the autumn might be too dry, and then your seed will not germinate. And then you will have harvest failure. So on the one hand, predictability that determines the agricultural cycle and this availability of food within the year, and on the other hand, you have this unpredictability. Now, complex societies, they required a certain extent of continuity in order to remain functioning as complex societies. And for that, so they needed, on the one hand, to distribute availability of food within the year, but also between years. So complex societies developed mechanisms to do that. And you can think of physical mechanisms, you can think of granaries, and you simply have to store what you harvest once a year. You have to store to be able to use that throughout the year, but you can also think of ships and harbor facilities that allow you to bring grain from one place to another. So physical mechanisms. But maybe even more important are the institutional mechanisms that allow these things to happen. All complex societies develop these institutional mechanisms, whether that is taxation, which is a state-based, a command-based mechanism, or whether that's market mechanisms, commercially driven, and usually it's a hybrid, usually it's a combination of more. But all these institutions, whether that's customs, whether that's legal regulations, they allow this distribution of food. They are means to ensure, to a certain extent, the availability of food, even though the natural environment is unpredictable, to ensure some level of continuity. And obviously, I do not mean to say that these mechanisms always succeeded perfectly to do that. Mechanisms often failed, and that would result in famines, that would result in mass starvation. But they succeeded sufficiently for these complex societies to remain functioning as complex societies. Now, how to relate this to climate change? There's a positive element to that, and there's a negative element. Positive, you can say, these mechanisms, physical, institutional mechanisms, they can also then be used as a strategy to cope with changes in the environment. If there's adverse climate change, you can use the same kind of mechanisms to deal with that. You can try to improve market integration. You can try to improve by storing more. So on the one hand, you have these mechanisms as tools, as elements of the resilience of a society to deal with changes in climate. But on the other hand, the complexity of these societies also brings in an element of inflexibility, which has to do with the path dependency and vested interests that are there in a society. So you cannot change easily the physical infrastructure. You cannot change that easily. So if you compare that to the mobility of these lakeshore settlements in Neolithic Switzerland, which could adapt easily to changes in the environment, that becomes a lot more difficult with complex societies, where you have this investment in a lot of physical infrastructure that you cannot change that easily. But even more importantly, the institutions of a society are a reflection of the power relations in that society. And the society has institutions that are created by the social political structure of that society. And that's also the element of religious and cultural conservatism. The world is as it should be, so there's an element of constraint in change. So my main point is that resilient strategies in complex societies, while on the one hand you have these tools to deal with adverse climate change, on the other hand there's also constraints there by the vested interests and the path dependency in those societies. Structural change might be at a cost as a social cost, particularly for those who are in power. So those segments of the society that determine the resilience strategy will be constrained by what is in their own interest. So that limits the resilience strategies of these societies. Now, but I do want to warn that we should not only talk about this in terms of a stagnant society that is only changed by some climatic impact, because societies are not stagnant. Societies are changing by themselves, so through all kinds of internal dynamics. And to just point out one aspect of that, it's one thing to have the coping mechanisms for a society that numbers communities of the thousands and a certain level of population. But when that society changes and communities of thousands of people turn into communities of hundreds of thousands of people, population, and the division of labor changes, that means that the coping mechanisms have to change as well. So it's not only that you have it's not the case that you have a stagnant society that only changes when climate starts to change, but you have a society that is always developing and always changing, and with it, its coping mechanisms. So, and that's coping mechanisms that are determining its vulnerability and resilience. And again, I do not mean to say that it's always in a positive sense, because there can also be societal changes that actually mean that these coping mechanisms will function worse, not better than before. So whether that is warfare, military conflicts, or other dynamics, it's not always the case that change is for the benefit. It's always for the better. So we have to include, when we talk about the vulnerability and resilience of societies, we have to include the way it can respond to climate change, but we also have to include the social dynamics itself. Now, time to go to the Roman Empire and Imperial China. So these maps do not really show the same thing, but what we see here is the towns and cities in the Roman Empire, let's say the 2nd century, and the size of the dots reflects the size of these towns and cities, with Rome clearly at the big city at the heart of the empire because of political power. There's one thing that I want to point out because that will become relevant later. If you look at the east of the Roman Empire, we clearly see that the larger cities are in the east of the Roman Empire. If you look at the west, it's a lot of towns and cities, but they tend to be small. Now, on the right-hand side, we have population density in China around 1100 of the year. Now, in many ways, these societies were quite similar. There are quite similarities between Imperial Rome and China. And as an illustration of that, I've taken a few texts. So from the Guanzi, and I'm not sure that I pronounced that correctly, but anyway, a text from the Han Dynasty with earlier parts. We can read there as an illustration, when the granaries are full, the people will know propriety and moderation. When their clothing and food are adequate, they will know the distinction between honor and shame. So if the food supply is in order, people will behave. That is what the text says. If you then go to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, it's a Greek in the Roman Empire, at the time of the first Emperor Augustus, and he wrote about the consuls, important magistrates in the Roman Empire, Roman Republic. The consuls took great care to supply Rome plentifully with both grain and other provisions, believing that harmony of the masses depended on well-being in this respect. So again, saying the harmony of the masses, if you want as political elites a good relationship with the common people, you have to make sure that they're well fed. And Lucan, another Roman from about that period, says it even clearly, above all things, the price of bread determines hate or favor. A starving mob has no respect. So we find a similar ideology, at least in the Roman Empire, in Imperial China, saying that one must pay attention to the food supply of these common people. And there was good reason to do that. It's in their own interest to do that. So both societies created a lot of mechanisms, physical and institutional mechanisms, that were to ensure stability of the food supply and to even out the natural unpredictability and variability, and to even that out by using all kinds of mechanisms. And that it failed, that's clear. Now, time to go to the Roman Empire, and I see that time is progressing, so I try to be short. In the Roman Empire, there's a lot of mechanisms to deal with that natural variability and unpredictability. So drainage and irrigation, and a lot of investment in drainage and irrigation to cope with agricultural conditions. A lot of investment in physical infrastructure, harbor facilities, roads, improving the ways that you can distribute food. Institutional mechanisms, very important. In the form of taxation, in the form of trade, and if you look at the 2nd century in the Roman Empire, there's quite a high level of market integration, at least in the core regions of the Roman Empire. So there's also a relatively low incidence of failure of the system. Famines are actually quite rare in the core of the Roman Empire at its height. But at some point, the Roman Empire declined and fell. And there's a theory that is now often repeated, that's widely believed, is that climate change was actually the determining factor in the fall of the Roman Empire. So the end of the Roman warm period brought adverse conditions, so harvests failed more often, that led to famines, that led to a lot more political tension and civil strife. So the weakened Roman state then fell. So the climate-driven narrative of a decline. Now, the situation is actually a lot more complex than that. First of all, if we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, we should talk about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Because it's not that the entire Roman Empire fell, because the eastern half of the Roman Empire continued and became the Byzantine Empire. So there's a lot of continuity, at least beyond late antiquity. So if you look at the Roman part, we have to actually distinguish several parts and to bring a complex story a bit shorter. If you take the orange part here, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, like I said before, this is the part where the big cities are, and this is the part where urbanization and complexity of the economy of society at large predates the Roman Empire by centuries. When the Romans came here, this was already a well-developed part of the ancient world. And it continued to be so. So up to the 6th century, population levels remain high, urbanization remains high, complexity of the economy remains high. If you look at Africa, that's a bit an intermediate position. The high point of Africa was actually in the 4th century, in terms of complexity, in terms of urbanization. Decline visible in the 5th century. But if you look at the Central European and Northwestern European parts of the Roman Empire, first of all, the complexity and the urbanization was a result of Roman presence there. Roman presence stimulated urbanization, and the presence of the Roman army stimulated urbanization complexity. So that was in the beginning of the empire. At a certain point, we see then decline. We see decline from, let's say, 200 in the 3rd century. We see signs of decline, clearly visible in urbanization. In 200 AD, 200 of the Common Era, we find a lot of towns. We just seen the map. A lot of towns, relatively small. A lot of towns and cities in the western half of the Roman Empire. In 400 AD, they're all but gone. Most of these towns and cities in the western half of the Roman Empire had disappeared by 400 AD. So we have to differentiate when we talk about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. So I would suggest an alternative story, an alternative narrative for the decline and the role of climate change. So, like I just said, if you look at the western half of the Roman Empire, there was growth in the sense of urbanization, in the sense of economic functioning in the early empire, which was largely state-driven. But then the role of the state and the role of the army that changed around 200. Obviously, that's a longer process, but it started to change. Instead of a stimulating factor, the state and the army became a burden. And that was one of the main causes. It's a very complex story, but let's say if the cities start to disappear, if the cities decline and disappear, that also has an impact on agricultural production, commercial agricultural production, because if the cities disappear, decline, and then disappear, for which our commercial agriculture functions, there's little reason to invest in commercial agriculture. If the cities disappear, then market integration declines, and because market integration functions basically on the basis of this urban network. So what you see is that in the early empire, gradually rising complexity, rising functioning also of these coping mechanisms, infrastructure, physical infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, and after a certain point, it's spiraling down. So these mechanisms that I have been talking about within the Roman society, market integration, intervention by elites in the urban food supply, that is disintegrating. So the main element that I want to emphasize is that the mechanisms within that society to deal with the always present variability of natural conditions, that declined. So the main point for me is that this society was less able to deal with the natural variability that's always there. So what is then the role of climate change? Obviously, there's a lot of blind spots. I tried to emphasize that at the beginning. We do not have the kind of detail for this period that we have for the more recent centuries, but it's clear that there were periods and regions that were affected by decades of worse conditions. But then the question is, to what extent then did these temporarily adverse conditions contribute to this decline? So what is the major factor? The worsening ability, so the higher vulnerability and the lower resilience of this society, or is the climate change the more important? I would tend to argue that it's the changes in society which made it less able to deal with the natural variability. That's the major factor. But it's very difficult without clear data to establish that planet. China. There's a lot of studies that claim that climate change is a determining factor in the changes in the societal changes of imperial China. So the end of dynasties, the beginning of new dynasties, generally linked in a lot of studies climate change. But I want to focus on one transition, that's the transition from the Ming Qing dynasty in the middle of the 17th century. The Manchu defeated the Ming armies in 1644, and that's then seen as the change from the Ming to the new Qing dynasty of the Manchu. Well, it's actually a bit more complex with the transition period, whatever. Now, mid-17th century, that we're the Little Ice Age, so studies used to point out, this is in the Little Ice Age, so that is the adverse conditions. More specifically, studies now point to cold periods and drier periods in the 17th century. Specifically, the late 16th, the early 17th century was also characterized by a low summer monsoon, bringing more relatively drier conditions to this to China, with a significant short dry period from 1638 to 1641, which is just before the Ming were defeated. So there seems to be a clear relationship between the climate change, the weakening of the Ming dynasty, and then its defeat by the Shu. But it is a bit more complicated because studies also point out that, well, there has been climate change within this Ming period before. for example, between 1430 and 1520, that was a relatively dry period, so it's not a drought of 90 years or something like that. But these 90 years were on average relatively drier than before or after. With the driest decades at the end of the 15th century and the cold spells, 40-year cold period, again in relative terms, between 1418 and 1518. And then, the study points out the extent of long-term drought from the mid to late 15th century to the early 16th century was much greater than that in the early 17th century during the decline of the Ming dynasty. So, and these authors point out, why would then the Ming dynasty fall because of climatic reasons when they survived a much more serious adverse climate change earlier, which was actually in the period that the Ming dynasty was relatively strong. So one of the explanations they give is that the Ming dynasty went from a command economy to a commercial economy. But that change meant that did not go with a sufficient control of material resources. So, I quote again from the study, under the pressure of extreme drought and Manchurian invasion in the 17th century, this extremely fragile socioeconomic model collapsed. The capacity of the Ming dynasty to reform the governance model had already been lost, which led to its collapse. So, what this study points out is it's not only the climate change that we have to take into account, but the weakening of the Ming dynasty. The vulnerability of the Ming dynasty had increased through to its worse functioning coping mechanisms in society. We can talk a bit more about that because one of the constant elements in Chinese history is the granary system. A granary system that is always used to even out the impact of these harvest shocks, of these climatic or better weather-induced harvest shocks. So the granary system was based on buying grain when there was a sufficient harvest, when there was a lot of availability of food, in order to sell it below market prices in times of dearth. But because harvest failure is difficult to predict, this was quite a costly system because you had to more often buy grain that you then had to keep. So it's difficult to predict when there actually is a harvest failure. So regularly you have to buy again. So this was quite a costly system. And the late Ming, as we have seen, did have a relatively low income, relatively low taxation. And on the other hand, they had to spend a lot of money on wars going on. So the late Ming did not have the resources to keep up the granary system. So you had a dysfunctioning granary system, which increased the vulnerability of this society to adverse climate change. If we then compare that to 18th century, during the Qing dynasty, one of the things was that the Qing dynasty invested a lot in this public granary system, in poor relief systems. There's another element, the market integration was improved a lot in the 18th century. So the canal system and the road system had been there before, but now in the 18th century, we see that the market functioned a lot better than before, thereby also evening out local differences in harvests. So you can say one of the elements is, of course, the climate change and the adverse climatic conditions, but we have to combine that with the societal weakness to deal with adverse conditions at the time of the late Ming. My final case study, I'll skip Finland in the 17th century, and that's Angkor. Angkor in Cambodia also a form of an early complex society, which is based on the control of the kings, the control of the aristocracies, of labor and resources, which is then used to maintain a large-scale water management system. So, and there we can clearly see the water management system was intended to even out the availability of water, created by reserves and reservoirs of water, canals. So, in a situation where the water availability is varied within the year because of the monsoon cycle and between years because the monsoon doesn't function equally each year, the water management system made possible this intensive agricultural system, this intensive rice cultivation. And on the basis of this intensive rice cultivation, 앙코르 would emerge. 앙코르 consisting of so-called Greater 앙코르, which is a fairly large region of some 3,000 square kilometers, having a population in a recent estimate of some 900,000 people. And then within that, 앙코르 core, the urban core of Greater 앙코르, with a population of 150,000 more. Now we see rapid expansion of 앙코르, in particular in the 12th, 13th century, a lot of monuments, the remains of which one can visit nowadays. But soon after that, you see the first signs of decline, in the sense of decline of intensive agriculture in Greater 앙코르 region. Then in 1431, an important date, the sacking of 앙코르 by the kings of Ayutthaya, which is in Thailand nowadays. But 앙코르 remained to be occupied until the 17th century. But there's a clear decline in the 15th century of 앙코르. Now, what caused this decline? And again, a lot of studies nowadays from the past 10 years, 15 years, a lot of studies point to climate change as the main cause of the decline and collapse of 앙코르, which is then related to shifts in the monsoon strength. And they point out that in the 14th and early 15th century, you had a combination of longer periods of low monsoon, so relatively drier conditions, but intermingled with years of very extreme monsoon, very strong, a lot of precipitation. And then the conclusion of these studies is, so the water management system was damaged by this extreme variability of the monsoon in that period. And when the water management system was damaged, 앙코르 could not be sustained. They could not sustain the intensive agriculture, and so 앙코르 declined and then fell. But again, there's some questions that you can pose, because if you look at the evidence of the paleoclimatic evidence, there have been periods of relatively dry conditions and high levels of variability before that. So in the 11th century, in the mid-13th century, you also have this kind of adverse climatic conditions. And that was actually at the time of the blossoming of 앙코르. So if 앙코르 could survive these earlier adverse periods, why would they then fall as a result of climatic conditions in later periods? Was the climate change of a significant different nature, or are there changes in society? Now, I think you will by now understand that my argument will be that it's the societal changes that are actually more important than climate change itself. The difficulty, again, is that we do not know that much about societal changes in 앙코르. This is a society which had written texts, but unfortunately, those written texts do not give us all the detail about societal changes that we want. But recent studies point to various societal changes that are relevant to this debate. And one is an external pull factor. This is a period, when we talk about the 13th, 14th century, this is a period that trade in Southeast and East Asia is increasing. China, there's much more trade with China, so trade is increasing in this part of the world. And so wealthy families could profit from that trade, but not in Angkor itself. So wealthy families would move to other places to profit from these increased trade opportunities. Another societal change that we see is that now a lot more attention is paid to fortification. So there's an indication that there's military threats more than before. So the kings are now paying more attention to building fortifications. Another element is changes in religion. Religion was the legitimation, was the basis of royal power in Angkor, but changes in religion that threatened and diminished that legitimation. So these are changes in society that are relevant. So if we then combine the idea, well, there had been changes of adverse climate change, there had been periods of high monsoon variability, and then Angkor survived. If you combine that with the realization that there are societal changes, then you might think that it is actually the societal changes that become much more. And actually, there is a recent study that actually points out that, gives that alternative scenario. So in the climate-driven scenario, it's climate change that damages the water management system, and that leads to societal collapse. But this alternative scenario says, maybe it's the society, suggests that it is the societal changes that come first. And when society changed, there was less attention to keep up the large-scale water management system. And then the large-scale water management system declined, and then that is what we see in the evidence. So the scenario is one of societal change, which can be related to the elite families moving away, not investing in the water management system. It can be related to the militarization and the larger military threats, so that kings would pay more attention to building fortifications rather than keeping up this huge-scaled water management system. And maybe there's also a role to the lesser legitimation of the position of the kings, which meant that they had less control about labor and resources. So societal decline came first, and the damage to the water management system came second. So again, a case where societal change is at least as important as is the climate change. Now, I've been talking too long, so unless somebody says, please explain what happened in Finland in the 17th century, but otherwise, we'll skip that. So my concluding remarks is societies are not passive. Societies respond to climate change. And in complex pre-industrial societies, the impact of climate change is always in relation to societal changes, and I would say determined by societal changes. Not all societies are always able to respond to climate change. And societies were the most vulnerable to adverse climate change if that was combined with periods of societal problems, of societal weakness. So, well, that's the end. Thank you for your attention. Okay, yeah.
main mistake of students today. 구매 계획도 보시면 그때 다 하셨겠지만 CC로 들어가시면 옵션으로 들어가시면 근데 이어서 기후변화가 패널을 진행할 예정입니다. 일단 패널 일단 과정으로 계획에서 시작하는 생각을 하셨고요.
Sure. I think you are very tired. We have a long journey from Europe to Korea. Even though you gave us one highly interesting lecture with no break. Okay. 연구차, I'm professor of history department at Vrije University. It's my honor to moderate today's panel session. I think today's meeting is very significant as humanities and science come together to discuss the current situation and try to find a solution of overcoming climate crisis. Today we have two panelists, specialists. Let me introduce the first, Dr. 앙코르와트의. As Emilio said, she is the former director of APEC Climate Center and also the director of National Institute of Meteorological Research. And she got her PhD from Texas University in USA, right? And she had many experience, not only in the research field, but in administration. Our second panelist is Dr. Kim Sung-jun. He is working currently as the Vice Director of Korea Polar Research Institute, right? And he got his PhD from Texas University in USA. And he published many articles and research papers regarding climate changes and climate crisis. So before starting our discussion, for the audience in participating in online, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. Okay. So. And first, Dr. Bon, I think we have many questions or comments. Okay. Thanks for your introduction and very nice, very impressive talk. Appreciate it. Hello again, I'm Song Jong Kim from Korea Polar Research Institute. And I'm a climate technologist. Actually, my training was physical oceanographer. But since 1990s, climate change was a huge global issue. So when I graduated Texas A&M, I was interested in climate change problem. And up to now, including the paleoclimate climatology, study the climate change issue now. From your talk, the societal decline or fall civilization is not just simple, it's very complex, right? So sometimes the human driver might be amplified by some natural disaster. You said that BC 450. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So the volcanic eruption influenced probably the some of this Roman, I mean the Julius Caesar's instant or whatever. Like that. So, but when I read the book by Edward Gibbon, the history of decline and fall of Roman Empire, it's an excellent book. But he claimed in his book, more or less, the Roman collapse of Roman Empire was driven by German movement to the across the border for the Rhine River Rhine. Now Germany, around Germany. But the movement of these German people was driven by Huns. They were in Central Asia, right? That means there was some trouble. I mean, the Hun people were in some trouble. Maybe, I don't know what's the situation at the time. So do you think that there's some climate issue would also influence these Hun people at the time? What's your opinion?
In the studies, in recent studies, it is often pointed out that the threat by the Huns, so the movement of the Huns from Central Asia, was triggered by climate change. It had to do with periods of a period of drier conditions and colder conditions, due to which grasses would grow less in Central Asia, and that would mean a weakening of the position of these Hun peoples, who were then forced out of Central Asia, and then they pushed these peoples that were bordering the Roman Empire, so Germanic peoples and other peoples, and they will push them towards the borders, and that's in some studies seen as an important element of the role of climate change in the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, interestingly, you also find an opposite scenario, because you find, for example, for the 12th century, it is argued that was a period in Central Asia of more warmer and more humid conditions that actually stimulated the growth of grass. And then some studies actually use the term grass power. So that meant that the Central Asian peoples became stronger and then could invade neighboring regions. Okay. So you find actually, you find actually two scenarios in the studies. One, it is adverse climate change forcing them out, but it can also be beneficial climate change in Central Asia, allowing them, giving them the strength threaten neighboring peoples. And to come back to your story, then, yeah, to what extent is the potentially climate-driven movement of the Huns, to what extent did that then cause the fall of the Roman Empire? I think again that we therefore have to see that in a longer perspective, because people's threatening the Roman Empire was nothing new that happened before. There's a lot of attention to changes in the Roman Empire itself. One element that's often forgotten when we have to discuss the external threats to the Roman Empire is that these people bordering, they were changing as well. They were changing in many ways. One important factor is their continuous relationship with the Roman Empire. They learned from the Roman Empire. They traded with people from these individuals from these peoples. They served in the Roman army. They fought against the Roman army. So they learned. So these peoples bordering the Roman Empire in the first century AD were completely different from these people functioning bordering the Roman Empire in the fourth century. That made them much more powerful opponents. So I think we have to take that into account as well. So again, I would say yes, that the Roman Empire in the West fell in the period after 400, around 400, in the first decades of the 5th century. That it fell due to invasions by foreign peoples, that is clear. But we have to take into account other elements as well. That's the weakening of the Western Empire. That's the stronger, that these opponents were stronger. And one element that's also very important, and that is, and I realize that this story is not about climate change, but I think that we have to realize that it is not only about climate change, that is the division of the fragmentation of the Roman Empire, which had to do with the fact that the various parts of the Roman Empire became less depending on the central Mediterranean core of the Roman Empire. If you look at the early empire, soldiers serving in Roman armies came from the Mediterranean. The peoples ruling the Roman Empire came from the Mediterranean. If you look at the 3rd, 4th century, the armies were recruited from the various regions. The provinces, the outer regions, they were actually delivering the people who were ruling the Roman Empire. So you had a fragmentation. Around 300, you had an emperor who created a new system, a system of 4 emperors, with the idea that you have a local emperor who can actually deal with the local conditions. But that had an adverse effect. That is, it strengthened the division of the empire. If we then look at the situation around 400, then that was the final division of the Roman Empire. So you had an Eastern Roman Empire and a Western Roman. And they saw each other as competitors. So while in previous centuries, the Roman Empire had functioned as an entity, and I would say the eastern half of the Roman Empire, as I've emphasized, with a much longer economic tradition, economic complexity, that was actually the wealthier part of it. And the West could not function, could not profit from that. What you find, maybe you know about the Goths who conquered Rome in the early 5th century. For the first time in 800 years that the city of Rome was actually conquered. That was actually the Goths first came into the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire in the east said, well, we leave you unharmed, just march through our part of the Roman Empire and please attack the western half of the Roman Empire. And then they did, and so they conquered the city of Rome. So what I want to say is it's a well-layered, a multi-layered story, the decline and fall. You have the immediately triggers like invasions, but you have fundamental layers of longer-term processes that make some people stronger or other than the Roman Empire weaker.
Okay, I think your answers is quite sufficient. So, just the time limitation, I have a rather short question. In the perspective of historical climate impact on this climate collapse of this civilization, ongoing global warming, now how it will be serious to our community, even though it's not vulnerable as before. It's historical period now. How do you think?
I think one of the differences, and I'm a specialist on ancient society.
Yeah,
So I
it's the future.
yeah. So yeah. No, but I think one of the differences, and that should be an advantage, is that we realize that climate is changing. So ancient societies never realized climate change. So they might talk about in the past everything was better, but that was their worldview. The Greeks and Romans, they were pessimists, and they always thought the past was better. The golden age is always in the past. Nowadays, it's worse. But they did not realize climate change. They did not realize the factors involved in climate change. And you would say, well, our understanding of how climate change would make it possible for us to deal with that better than the Romans did. So our understanding is much better than the understanding of any previous society. So you would say, oh, that makes us much more resilient. I'm afraid I'm quite pessimistic in that, in the sense that even though another element is that we have much more stronger coping mechanisms than any pre-modern society. Our institutional and technical and physical ability to deal with that, with climate change, you would assume that's much better than of any previous society. And still, I'm quite pessimistic. And I think that one of the elements, but that is just based on my intuition, is that one of the hampering things is the lack of solidarity, the lack of global solidarity. Every society, we think in terms of national interest. So, yes, of course, we can deal with our energy sources. We can, okay, we should burn less coal, but then energy becomes much more expensive. And then that's bad for our industry, because our competitors, if they do not do the same thing, then we lose our competitive advantage. So let's keep burning coal for some time, even though we all realize it. So I think even though in theory you would say our position in terms of climate change is better than any previous society in terms of understanding, in terms of means to deal with them, I think the problem is not in technicalities, but it's in our way of thinking and our lack of global solidarity. And if I look, one of the threats in the future is sea level rising. And you would say, well, the Netherlands, most of our countries will meters below sea level anyway. But I don't think that the Netherlands is really a threat, because we have built dikes, we have dunes, and we can cope. I think other parts of the world, they do not have those needs to deal with that. So they were much more vulnerable.
Sure.
So, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you. As a moderator, I would like to also participate in your Q&A session. Just two things to say. One thing is actually we are still reading Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall, but the Decline and Fall theory is a little outdated. Nowadays we are saying transformation from from Roman Empire to Middle Age. So late antiquity, so concept of Peter Brown, concept coined by Peter Brown. So and the other thing is eco and climate change anxieties. These are two coins or two sides of one coin. Eco anxiety or climate anxiety, they can lead us to so serious concern of climate crisis. But however, in another hand, they can lead us to depression or hopelessness because we, sorry to say, we as a papagay or parrot say, repeat the same things without achieving any desirable outcomes. So that's the question. Climate anxiety and eco anxiety is necessary, but what can we do more with these anxieties? So I think we, about that we can more discuss. Okay, please, one.
Yeah. Well, actually, I found out that what I wanted to talk that the Kim already said so much.
I'm sorry about that.
No. I mean, maybe it is because most of us are natural scientists. Yeah. First, I want to say that I really enjoy your talk, and I am a climate scientist. But when I studied climate science and think about the past climate change, and also I studied climate change as well. And when I first started doing research on climate change, I was very I didn't think seriously about this. I said, yeah, climate is changing. That was my attitude. And then when I investigate climate change further and further, I was really worried about the future, because the reason is the rate of change is so large. So I was wondering whether we really can cope with this kind of change, especially like 2024 last year. The temperature, global temperature, has highest record since the observation from the 1850 or since it is like almost now we are thinking about almost 175 years of data, but this is it's only the instrumental data, and then using the past data we can look at the further past, and then we think this is really unprecedented for several thousand years. And then especially when we look at the change of rate of change, then I think maybe it is, not just the past 1,000 years. I think we should say past, million years or so.
I guess so.
Yeah.
More than million.
More than million years, including the glacial period. So when I think about climate change, I think about the rate of change. And of course, you already talk about the change in the local sense is different from the global change. So like when we look at the this little ice age or medieval warming, that kind of thing, but I think the signal is different from the European region to the East Asian region. So we have different signals, but of course some of the signals are very common, but some of them the magnitude is a little bit different. So I was wondering about this whether our society can cope with this kind of challenge. And another thing is you talk about the extreme events, and I think the danger of this extreme event is that our society has a coping mechanism, but that is actually developed from the past experience. It is not developed from the future experience. What's going to happen? So people do not want to invest money on the coping mechanism, right? And also, not just the society. So I think also the natural system itself is also shaped by the past climate, like a river system, or the shape of the mountain. That kind of thing is actually, shaped from the, like last, several hundred years of climate forms this kind of natural system. So if I look at the 2022, the flood cases in Germany and the Belgian case, and to me, it is really surprising because that they received only 200 millimeters of rainfall for a couple of days. And then they have this casualties about 200 people. But in Korea, 200 millimeters a day rainfall is very common in summertime. So in our case, when you look at the bridge over the Han River, the bridge itself is very high, from the water level. But in European country, the bridge is very low. It is very close to the water level. Like if you go to the Seine, River Seine, or other, rivers. I think, but people do not think about the changing this societal system, or the changing the preventing this disaster for the river system. So I wanted to say this because if we look at the history, maybe this impact of the climate change, local climate change, might be magnitude could be smaller than the expected future magnitude of climate change. So I was wondering, you talk about the collapse of a dynasty. I was wondering, is there a good case of this success of a dynasty? Even there is a climate, adverse climate issues.
So if there are examples of beneficial climate change then
Adverse climate change, but the coping is adverse impact because of this societal or leadership of a dynasty. I mean, the king could do something to to cope with this kind of universe.
you mean adverse in the sense of worse?
Worse impact, but coping. I mean, and then what should I say? Succeeding
Resolving the
resolving the problem.
Okay.
I think that thing would be if we can say something about yeah, like even though this thing happened, but this good governance can, you know, it succeed even with this kind of adverse climate issue. So this is kind of a practice that we would like to look at.
Mm. Whether we can learn from, whether we can learn from history. Yeah, I think it would be ideal if we then could point out to experiences in the past, and then we could say, if we could do the same thing, then we could solve our problem. Unfortunately, I'm a bit skeptical that we can use past societies in that sense, in the sense that the way our society functions is quite different from how modern society functions. So I do think that it is important to look at the past, to get insights of how environment and society interacted in the past. But I'm afraid that it is not in the sense that we can actually take examples from the past and then say, we can implement this measure, because our society functions quite differently. But I do think that there are examples of societies that cope much better with the climatic variability. And I think that what you say, global warming is much more serious than what we've seen in the past thousands of years and maybe millions of years. But I cannot talk about millions of years, but I'm quite convinced because, well, research does point out that if up to global warming, climatic trends were not synchronous. So you had a lot of different trends in different places, and now so this is different. But if we look at the past, there are examples of societies. No, so the point that I wanted to make is, so global warming is different, but if we look at the past, it's not because of this idea of climatic eras. Sometimes it's actually presented as if the Roman war period was centuries of good weather. It was centuries of nice summer warmth and an occasional shower. It did not work. So climate change did not operate like that. So climatic variability was something that was in all periods. All centuries experienced this climatic variability and harvest shocks. And maybe, and that's the extent of climate change, in some periods, the extremes were a little bit stronger. Like you say now with the floodings in Germany and Belgium. So if there's a warmer period, then the showers will be more extreme because, well, the atmosphere can contain much more water, and when it comes down, there comes down a lot more. But things like that have happened in as well. So I think that there's plenty of examples of societies that coped in relative sense better with that than in other periods. And I would say to some extent the early Roman period is such a period where you had good policies to allow market exchange of food supplies, where you had mechanisms in cities. So it's often said bread and games. If we talk about Romans, one term is bread and games. So corruption of the peoples by giving them games and giving them bread. But I think if you think about it, why is if the Christian prayer, give us our daily bread, it's not only symbolic, but it is a prayer to the gods. Make sure that you have to eat each and every day. So if the Romans gave the people in the city of Rome their bread, it's not simply a corruption, but it's simply because a city of 1 million inhabitants in this period was very vulnerable. Any rumor would cause a lot of fluctuation in the grain prices. So it gives security. And so I think, yeah, the early Roman Empire, but there's always an advantage for one segment of society can also be a disadvantage for other segments of society. So we often talk about resilience of societies, but I think we also have to differentiate there, because if we're talking about resilience for whom, it's actually also a question that we have to ask. Because, well, the stability of the food supply for the people in the city of Rome, which were close to the rulers, which was seen as important, was also at the cost of others, because other people were more vulnerable because food availability was at the cost of people who had to work harder or who had to deliver. So if we're talking in terms of resilience, we always have to take into account resilience of whom, actually, because what makes some people in society more resilient, not vulnerable, can actually mean that other people are more vulnerable and less resilient.
During the Roman Empire, even the Roman is surrounded by this Mediterranean Sea. That's why we have very nice weather, high pressure, mild and a little bit of rain and very pleasant weather. So, but Roman Empire has lots of colony in North Africa, Middle East, France, Gallian areas, even British.
Yeah.
So they, imported all his food from everywhere, like grains, and so they don't have too much worry about the local weather, to my understanding. So even you need to also think about the colonies weather, because that's directly related to food security to the central. So not only just a Roman itself.
Yeah.
I also agree with, because when we were talking about the other day, and we think about during the Little Ice Age, after the medieval warming, the Little Ice Age, and during some of those times, the European countries, they have many colonies.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, from the Africa or North and South America. So they got some resources from these colonies. So maybe this would be the one of the reasons why that the Western Europe can endure much better. Yeah.
overcome the crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sense of
Yeah.
of the other people.
It's a big question, but sorry, we have not enough time. I think we have a question from the floor, from the young generation audience. Do you have any questions or yes, please?
Firstly, it's an honor to attend this meaningful
Sorry,
conversation.
no.
Yes,
No.
it's an honor to attend this meaningful conversation with you. And the main question is, well, it seems climate change is a long-term perspective of perspective in comparing the history. So the main question is that, well, is it time or quantity of data that strengthen the logic of climate change in comprehending history? So
I fail to understand. Elaborate. What exactly is your question?
is it time or quantity of data that strengthen the logic of climate change, the factor of climate change in comprehending history? Because, well, I'm telling that if the quantity of data is enough, can we shorten the time of climate change factors
Okay, I see your point. So I try to say that because of the greater detail that we now have with for the reconstruction with the natural proxy data. So we have much more evidence than let's say 100 years ago, but also much more evidence than 20, 30 years ago. So our image of climate change has improved because we have that much more detail. So now we can say reconstruct climate much more precisely, and that has really changed the way we envision, we see climate change. So while you can still talk vaguely in terms of Little Ice Age or medieval war, I think we have to realize that there's a lot of variation within it. That was not possible with the data that one had up to 30 years ago. But there's also another element to that, because it's often claimed that the climatic conditions, for example, in the Roman warm period, and some people talk about not only the Roman warm period, they call it the Roman Hun warm period, because the Roman warm period seems a little bit Eurocentric. So they talk about the Roman Hun period to include. But anyway, so sometimes it is said, well, the Roman warm period had much more stable weather conditions than later times. And I wonder to what extent, but maybe the paleoclimatologists here can answer that question, to what extent that appears to be more climate stability, in the sense that if we go back 2,000 years, we do not have this annual reconstruction. Because if we look at lake sediments, they give a resolution of several decades. So you can say something about, well, these 10, 20 years, they were wetter than the 10, 20 years before or after that. And 10 years at best. The stalagmites, exactly the same thing. So if you have, going back 2,000 years, you do not have the local tree ring evidence. You have the highly resolved Greenland ice cores and other ice cores, but that doesn't really say something because of the variation. Doesn't really say something about Greenland ice. Doesn't say something about Spain. Doesn't say something about Turkey. It doesn't really say something about Korea. So we lack the highly resolved data for those early periods to reconstruct it at the season or the year. And then it appears to be a more stable climate. It's the kind of data that we have that determines how we see it. So it appears like a stable situation, but it might be that our evidence simply hides a similar level of variability. But that would be something that the paleoclimatologists might be better positioned.
Okay, I think we have no more question from floor or from the participant in online. Oh, okay.
Yes, thank you, Professor. I was just wondering so if you're talking a jungle yeah, it's a huge Sudan. I was just wondering if there were any studies in I don't know in paleontology, like as to the extent as to it how climate change affected different parts of the world, and if there were any attempts at maybe creating an map of the entire or any studies similar, any studies attempting something similar in intent.
Yeah, you have studies that actually study the regional variability. So there's one study that actually points out, if you look at the Mediterranean, so there's the study of the Mediterranean, the first millennium, looking at it. When are the trend breaks based on speleothems, lake sediments, and all that kind of evidence? Then they show that there's different timing of trend breaks, but also different trends in various parts of the Mediterranean, not only in terms of temperature, but even more so in terms of precipitation. So in one part, so one speleothem might indicate that in this period, there's a trend towards higher precipitation. And at the same time, another speleothem, stalagmite, in another part of the Mediterranean shows a decline. So based on that kind of evidence, they identified several climatic systems within the Mediterranean. So only within the Mediterranean, and as you pointed out, Roman Empire stretched far beyond that. So even only in the Mediterranean, you have several climatic systems, each with their own trends, each with their own different trend grids. So it's very hard. It's actually impossible to say something about climate change in terms of the Roman Empire. It's impossible to say something about climate change in terms of the Western Roman or the Eastern Roman. You should actually go to quite regional. And I have, there's a postdoc in my department who studies, who try to study, and I have to say, then we come to the limits of what you can study, to try to link climate change in central Italy. So that's the region that we're actually looking at, a very small part compared to the entire Roman Empire. Just central Italy, going from the Mediterranean to the Adriatic Sea, over 7 centuries, reconstruct as best as we can the climate change over that period, temperature, precipitation, and then linked what we see in terms of society, settlement patterns. So archaeology allows us to say something about settlement patterns, exploitation. Now, we had good hopes that we could draw clear. And so where did habitation disappear, for example? Where do we see shifts between the exploitation of the countryside at high altitudes compared to low altitudes? Because that might say something about the actual impact of climate change in this society. The problem turns out to be that our resolution of the climate change still is too low. It's too low, but also the resolution of our reconstruction of changes in society is quite low itself. So you have 2 processes with a very low resolution image that you then try to link to each other. So there's limitations. But I think that's absolutely correct. We should try to get progress in the analysis of the impact of climate change by focusing on smaller regions. And studies like the impact of climate change on Rwanda, we shouldn't do that kind of thing. You should really focus. And if I may add, but I realize that my answers are not very long time. But if you look at central Italy, that's a very diverse landscape. You have the mountains, the Apennines going from north to south through central Italy. That means we're talking about precipitation levels. Within Italy, you have parts of Italy that receive 2,000 millimeters, 2,500 millimeters of rainfall each year. But you also have parts of Italy that are quite close together. That has to do with the fragmentation. You have parts of Italy that receive less than 600 millimeters of rainfall each year. So then the same trend, even in regions that are very close together, will have a different impact. A drying trend will have quite a different impact in a region that receives 2,000 millimeters of rainfall each year. And the same trend in the region that has only 600 millimeters. That's a different impact. So we really have to take that kind of thing into account. So talking in very large, grand narratives, that does not bring us any further.
So, thank you. So our today's last question. What question? Okay.
You know, stay, let me stay, and I want to ask you two short questions. First, I think the climate change, we cannot control climate change first. So the important thing is adaptation. If they just the society is not healthy and they adapt to climate change. So what can history do to adapt better adaptation in present? And second one is, it's my first time to talk with a person who studied climate and history, and I'm a undergraduate student who studying history. So I want to ask you, what is the meaning of history to you, and why we do study history? And so ultimately, what is the history?
Okay, that's a very big question. That's a very big and important question. It's actually a very relevant question. And why is it relevant? If I try to get funding for a research project, I always have to say, what's the relevance of it? And then, so the same template is used for people who have a project of curing cancer. So if I compare, what's the relevance of historical research? Well, we're not making people healthier. We're not making economic progress or something. So I think, why did I study history? Because I think it's interesting. It's important to understand, to widen our perspective. And you can widen your perspective by looking at other cultures, but you can also widen your perspective by looking at past times. That's what I find fascinating about history. What's the relevance of studying climate change in the past for the current problems? And I expected that question. And then I still have to say, I think it's limited. I wish I could say, we can find a solution in the past, but I'm afraid that we can't find a solution. Like I said, it's not that we can say, the Chinese did this, or the Romans did that. If we do the same thing, then we solve the problem. But I do think that we can look at the past and then see that if we not learn from the past, and then the solidarity comes in, we have to change our mindset, I think, and that may be the lesson. But I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical. I'm not certain that people will learn the lessons and then change that.
Okay, again.
I have a question. So during the dinner time, you mentioned about tactics to see and learn history. We need to reform to understand. So I'd like to hear like a little bit more on
About, yeah, I think that was about the interdisciplinarity when we're talking about being a climatologist looking at the past. And I think one of the things that historians should be good at is being critical about claims, being critical about statements, being critical about sources and what they say, because I think that's not sure that is what you're meaning, but sometimes if you read studies by non-historians, that's not only paleoclimatologists, but there's a lot of geographers and other people involved. They have a simple narrative if it is about societal change. So, and I think that's the contribution of history. At the same time, if historians look at other disciplines, they made similar mistakes because I try to understand paleoclimatology as best as I can. But what I see, a lot of historians, they do not interpret the paleoclimate studies correctly because paleoclimatologists are very careful about the nuance. Paleoclimatologists are usually very careful about the levels of uncertainty that are there. But then you get historians and they want to pick out of the story that fits their narrative. And then they forget about the levels of uncertainty. And so they pick out. So I think that's one of the dangers of interdisciplinarity, that if you use the data from another discipline, that you really have to be careful to include the nuance of that discipline.
Because historians, they do not understand the scientific data, how uncertain they are, and how it's very difficult to do a historian from, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Very
Yeah, but I think when the natural scientists say uncertainty, that actually is doesn't mean that it is uncertain. Yeah, we know what it is, but there is not. It is not the exact number that we know. We know the number should be within this range. That's the uncertainty. But when natural scientists say something about uncertainty, then the other people think different.
I think there's still, because exact sciences, the exact science of Greenland icebergs, they give you an exact measurement of the stable isotopes in this ice level. That's exact. But to go from the stable isotope values to the climate change, then you have to interpret that. That brings into a level of uncertainty. And if you're interpreting the stable isotopes of speleocenes, that even increases that, because, well, each cave is different. So interpreting one stalagmite stable isotopes requires, well, you have to analyze these. So that brings in, so while the stable isotope figure is an exact figure without any level of uncertainty, transforming that into a reconstruction of temperature or precipitation brings into it a level of uncertainty.
That's why you could proxy it.
Yeah, exactly. And so historians often confuse that, and then they more very black and white unnuanced. Yeah. So yeah. So interdisciplinarity brings dangers, and unfortunately, the voice of historians, I would say, is not often heard. It starts to change. If you look at the IPCC reports, the early IPCC reports had a lot of information about the past. So there were these graphs about the past. Not one historian was involved in these early IPCC reports with all these claims about the past in it. And that actually created misunderstandings, because there's this famous case of one IPCC report, and I forget exactly the year, and there was one of the earliest, and they gave this huge bump of the medieval warm period. Which
I remember.
Yeah, and then
Totally wrong.
completely wrong. But that led to a lot of confusion. And it's actually used abused by climate change deniers in the United States, where you had senators saying, UN senators saying, but look at that IPCC report. It actually shows that the temperature in the Middle Ages was higher than right now. So, and then, and then that was corrected because, well, the realization was that this graph was wrong. And that led to the accusation that there was this conspiracy, a conspiracy. So there was actually debate in the United States Senate about the conspiracy in the IPCC that now hides. So it's the Trumpians that can actually abuse this kind of thing. So if they had included historians in the early IPCC reports, that would not have happened because. So it's not that I'm saying, I'm a historian and therefore they should include historians, but not including historians can actually play a role in politics with the Trumpian senators using that in their climate change denialist narratives.
It's time to wrap up our meeting. Before closing our meeting, I would like to say thank you, Emilia and Gangun Shir, the director of People for Force, for your cooperation and generosity. And thank you for your participation and attention, and good night.
Okay, yeah, if anybody wants to.
내가 볼게.